By the time the broadcast ended, Sarah Huckabee Sanders would sit in complete silence for 23 seconds while the entire nation watched. One phrase would haunt her forever. "Governor, I have the transcripts." What made her say nothing, absolutely nothing, for nearly half a minute of live television? You're going to want to hear this. The setting was a Sunday morning political panel on a major network, the kind of high-stakes format where political figures come to control narratives and shape public perception. Sarah Huckabee Sanders arrived with the confidence of someone who had spent years as White House press secretary, someone accustomed to dominating rooms, deflecting questions, and walking away unscathed. She wore a crisp navy suit, her makeup camera ready, her posture relaxed in the way that powerful people project when they believe they've already won the conversation before it begins. Seated across from her was Representative Jasmine Crockett, dressed in a simple charcoal blazer, her hair pulled back, her expression neutral. The panel moderator introduced the topic, recent cuts to education funding in Arkansas under Sanders' governorship, and turned first to Sanders for her opening statement. Sanders leaned forward slightly, her smile practiced and dismissive in equal measure. "Look, I think it's important we have this conversation with people who actually understand governing," she began, her tone pleasant but edged with something sharper. "With all due respect to the representative, she's been in Congress for 2 years? I've been governing a state. I've been in the White House. I've made decisions that actually affect people's lives, not just voted on bills that go nowhere." She paused, letting the insult breathe. "So when we talk about education policy, I think we need voices at the table who've actually run something, who've actually had to make the hard choices. Not just people who tweet well." The camera cut briefly to Crockett. She did not react. She simply wrote something in the leather folio on her lap, her pen moving in small, deliberate strokes. The moderator, visibly uncomfortable, tried to redirect, but Sanders was not finished. "And frankly," Sanders continued, her voice rising slightly with the confidence of someone who believes interruption is a form of dominance, "I think the American people are tired of being lectured to by people who've never actually accomplished anything. They want results. They want leaders who've been tested. They want people who understand that governance is about more than viral moments and performative outrage." Crockett's pen never stopped moving. She did not look up. Sanders settled back into her chair, her expression satisfied. She had framed the conversation exactly as she intended. Experience versus inexperience. Substance versus performance. A governor versus a congresswoman barely into her first term. The moderator turned to Crockett, the question almost apologetic in its framing, as though expecting a defensive response or an emotional reaction to what had just been said. Crockett looked up from her notes. Her face was perfectly composed. Her voice, when she spoke, was measured and calm, the kind of calm that comes not from passivity, but from preparation. "Governor Sanders just made several claims about leadership, experience, and results," she said quietly. "I'd like to address those claims specifically, if that's all right, because I think the facts tell a different story than the one we just heard." She opened the folio on her lap. Inside were tabbed sections, each one marked with a small colored flag. The camera caught the detail. "This was not a prop. This was organized research. You mentioned your experience as White House press secretary as evidence of your qualifications," Crockett continued, her tone still gentle, almost conversational. "I want to acknowledge that publicly. You held that position for 2 years under President Trump. That is a matter of public record." She paused, looking directly at Sanders. "But Governor, your tenure in that role is also a matter of public record in other ways. Would you say that your time as press secretary was characterized by accuracy and transparency with the American people?" Sanders's smile tightened slightly, but she recovered quickly. "I think I did my job with integrity every single day." Crockett nodded as though considering this. "I appreciate that answer," she said, "because I have some documentation here that I think is relevant to this conversation about leadership and results." She turned to the first tabbed section. "The Washington Post fact-checking database documented 52 false or misleading statements you made from the White House podium during your tenure. 52. Not opinions, not political spin. Statements that were factually, demonstrably untrue." Sanders opened her mouth to respond, but Crockett's voice, still calm, continued. "For example, on March 14, 2018, you stated from the podium that President Trump had never called the press the enemy of the people. The statement was made at 3:47 p.m. Eastern Time. By 6:30 p.m. that same evening, multiple news organizations had compiled video evidence of the president making that exact statement on at least 7 separate occasions, including twice on camera during rallies. You were asked about the discrepancy the following day. Do you remember your response?" The room had gone very quiet. Sanders' face had lost some of its color, but her voice when she spoke was still firm. Those were different contexts. The media took things out of context constantly. Crockett turned another page. May 29, 2018. You stated that the president's tweets were official White House statements and should be treated as policy. June 7, 2018, 9 days later, you stated that the president's tweets were personal opinions and not official policy. Both statements made from the same podium, both on the record. She looked up. Governor, which one was the truth? Sanders' hands gripped the armrests of her chair slightly. Again, you're taking things out of context. The role of press secretary is to communicate. The role of press secretary, Crockett interrupted gently, is to provide accurate information to the American people. That's the job description. Accuracy, transparency, truth. She turned to another tabbed section. Let's talk about results, since you mentioned that. You referenced your governorship of Arkansas as evidence of your leadership. Specifically, you mentioned education policy. I'd like to examine that claim. She pulled out a single sheet of paper, holding it so the camera could see the official state seal watermarked across the top. This is the Arkansas Department of Education's own report, published in January of this year. It shows that under your administration, per-pupil spending in Arkansas has dropped by $647 per student compared to the previous administration. $647 per child. That's a 12% reduction in real funding. Sanders leaned forward, her voice rising. That's because we eliminated wasteful bureaucracy and focused resources on the classroom. Teacher salaries in Arkansas, Crockett continued, her voice not rising to match, have dropped to 47th in the nation under your leadership, 47th out of 50 states. The average teacher in your state now makes $39,200 per year, which is $14,000 below the national average. Is that what you mean by focusing resources on the classroom? Those numbers don't reflect. They reflect the Department of Education's own reporting, Crockett said, and something in her voice had changed. It was still calm, it was still measured, but there was something colder underneath now, something that made Sanders stop mid-sentence. These are your administration's numbers, Governor. Your Department of Education published this data. I didn't write this report. Your own staff did. She turned to another section. Let's talk about testing scores, since educational outcomes are presumably what we care about. Arkansas reading proficiency among third graders has dropped by 9 percentage points since you took office. Math proficiency has dropped by 7 points. These are State Board of Education numbers, not partisan estimates, not think tank projections. Your own state's official assessment data. Sanders tried again, her voice sharper now. You're cherry-picking statistics to make a political point. I'm reading your administration's published results, Crockett said quietly. You said Americans want leaders who deliver results. These are your results, Governor. Third grade reading proficiency, down 9 points. Teacher salaries 47th in the nation. Per pupil spending down $647 per child. Those are the results you delivered. The moderator attempted to interject, to move the conversation forward, but Sanders spoke over him, her voice carrying the edge of someone who feels control slipping. This is exactly the kind of partisan attack politics that Americans are tired of. Crockett looked up from her notes. Governor Sanders, nothing I have said is partisan. I have not mentioned your party affiliation once. I have not questioned your motives. I have simply read aloud the data your own state agencies published. If the facts sound like an attack, that tells us something, but it doesn't tell us the facts are wrong. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but it felt longer. Sanders' jaw worked as though searching for words that wouldn't come. Finally she managed, You're twisting. I'm not twisting anything, Crockett said. I'm going to show you exactly what I'm reading from. She held up the document so both Sanders and the camera could see it clearly. Arkansas Department of Education, Office of the Secretary, January 12, 2025. Would you like me to read the page number and paragraph where the per-pupil spending figure appears? Sanders said nothing. Crockett set the paper down and opened another folder. This one was thicker, the tabs more numerous. You mentioned that you've made hard choices. You mentioned that you've been tested. Let's talk about one of those choices. On August 3rd of last year, your administration announced cuts to the Arkansas Medicaid expansion program, specifically targeting coverage for an estimated 68,000 low-income adults. You stated at the time that this was necessary to balance the state budget and eliminate dependency. Do you remember making that statement? Sanders' voice was quieter now. We had to make difficult fiscal decisions. The state budget that year, Crockett said, showed a surplus of $1.2 billion. $1.2 billion. So the cuts were not made because the money didn't exist. They were made despite the money existing. She turned a page. At the same time those cuts were announced, your administration pushed through a corporate tax reduction package that decreased state revenue by approximately $320 million annually. So to be clear, you cut healthcare for 68,000 people while simultaneously reducing corporate tax obligations by $320 million per year in a year when the state had a $1.2 billion surplus. Those tax cuts create jobs and economic growth. The Arkansas Bureau of Labor Statistics report from November, Crockett interrupted, still calm, shows that job growth in your state has been flat for the past 18 months. Flat. Not declining, but not growing either. The economic growth you projected has not materialized in measurable employment data. She looked up. But the healthcare cuts did materialize. 68,000 people lost coverage. That part happened exactly as announced. Sanders' face had gone from pale to flushed, a deep red creeping up her neck. You're cherry-picking data to create a narrative that isn't, Governor, Crockett said, and her voice was still quiet, still controlled, but there was something in it now that made Sanders stop talking. I haven't cherry-picked anything. I have systematically presented data from official state sources documenting the outcomes of your governance. If those outcomes don't align with the narrative you prefer, that's not my problem. That's your record. She pulled out another document, this one printed on what appeared to be congressional letterhead. I want to share something with you and with everyone watching. 3 weeks ago, my office received a letter from a woman named Catherine Morales. She's a teacher in Little Rock. She has taught 5th grade for 16 years. She has a master's degree in education. She works a second job on weekends at a grocery store to supplement her income. She wrote to me because she wanted someone in Congress to know what it feels like to teach in Arkansas right now. Crockett's voice softened slightly, the prosecutorial edge giving way to something more human. She wrote, I have students who come to school hungry because their parents lost Medicaid and now can't afford both food and the medications that keep them functional enough to work. I have colleagues who've left the profession entirely because they can't survive on $39,000 a year in an economy where rent alone costs $1,600 a month. I have a classroom with textbooks from 2012 because there's no budget for new materials. And I watch the governor on television talking about results and leadership, and I wonder if she's ever spent a single day in a public school classroom in the state she governs. The studio was absolutely silent. Even the moderator, who had been attempting periodic interventions, had gone still. Crockett folded the letter and set it down gently. Catherine Morales is not a partisan talking point, Crockett said. She's a real person with a real life affected by real policy decisions. And there are thousands of people like her in Arkansas right now, living with the results you mentioned so proudly at the beginning of this conversation. Sanders tried to respond, her voice strained. One anecdotal letter doesn't represent. It's not one letter, Crockett said. She reached down beside her chair and lifted a box onto the table. It was a standard file box, the kind used for document storage, and it was full. This box contains 237 letters, emails, and written testimonies from Arkansas teachers, parents, healthcare workers, and Medicaid recipients. 237, all sent to my congressional office in the past 6 weeks, all describing the same patterns: funding cuts, coverage losses, teachers leaving, students suffering. She set the box down with a soft thud that somehow carried more weight than if she'd slammed it. So no, Governor, this is not one anecdotal letter. This is systematic documentation of the human cost of your policy choices. Sanders' hands were gripping the armrests so tightly now that her knuckles had gone white. Her voice when she spoke was higher, tighter, the practiced calm completely gone. This is an ambush. This is a setup. I came here for a policy discussion, not to be attacked with out-of-context numbers and sob stories. Governor Sanders, Crockett said, and her voice cut through the rising panic in Sanders' tone like a blade through silk. You opened this conversation by questioning my qualifications. You questioned my experience. You questioned whether I had accomplished anything. You suggested I was here for viral moments rather than substance. She leaned forward slightly. Everything I have presented to you today is substance. Every number has a source. Every claim has documentation. Every statement has been fact-checked. If that feels like an ambush, it's only because you walked into this conversation unprepared to defend your record with facts. Sanders opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came. Crockett reached for one more document. I want to ask you one question, Governor, just one, and I want you to take your time before you answer because I think the answer matters. She held up a printed spreadsheet, numbers visible in neat columns. This is the Arkansas budget allocation for fiscal year 2025. Line item 4712 is the governor's office operational budget. Your office, Governor. The amount allocated is $2.4 million, which represents an 18% increase over the previous year's allocation. She set the paper down and looked directly at Sanders. Governor, can you explain to the teachers making $39,000 a year and to the 68,000 people who lost health care coverage why your office needed an 18% budget increase in the same year you cut education funding and Medicaid? The silence that followed was total. Sanders stared at Crockett. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged. The studio cameras held on her face, capturing every micro-expression as she searched for an answer that wouldn't come. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Someone in the control booth made the decision to hold the shot rather than cut away, and the silence stretched on. 20 seconds. In the press gallery, the sound of typing had stopped. Every journalist in the room was watching. 23 seconds. Finally, Sanders found words, though they came out broken and uncertain. That budget, that's for operational. For staff and, it's not comparable to. It's not comparable, Crockett repeated quietly. You're right. $647 taken from each student's education is not comparable to a $2.4 million office budget increase. One is a necessity cut from children who have no voice in the process. The other is an increase granted to an office already functioning at full capacity. You're absolutely right, they're not comparable. Sanders's face had gone through several color changes, finally settling on a mottled red that suggested either rage or humiliation or both. She turned to the moderator, her voice desperate now. This is not a fair representation of... Everything the representative has stated is a matter of public record, the moderator said quietly. It was the first time he'd spoken in several minutes, and the statement carried the weight of someone who'd been fact-checking in real time. The documents she's referenced are all published by official Arkansas state agencies. Sanders turned back to Crockett, and something in her expression had changed. The confidence was gone. The dismissiveness was gone. What remained was something closer to panic. You planned this, she said, and her voice had dropped to almost a whisper. You came here with all of this prepared. Yes, Crockett said simply. I did. You questioned my qualifications at the start of this segment. You suggested I didn't understand governing. You implied I was here for performance rather than substance. She gestured to the folders, the box, the documents spread across the table. Governor Sanders, I spent 40 hours preparing for this conversation. I read every budget document your administration has published. I reviewed every press statement you've made as governor. I compiled testimony from real people affected by your policies. I did the homework. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a finality that made clear she was reaching the end of what she had to say. You opened this conversation by dismissing me because I've only been in Congress for 2 years. But Governor, length of service is not the same as quality of service. You've been in politics longer than I have. You've held higher offices than I have. But when we compare actual results, measurable, documented, verifiable results, your record does not support the authority you claimed at the beginning of this discussion. Sanders sat frozen, her face still flushed, her hands still gripping the armrests. She looked like someone who wanted desperately to leave but couldn't figure out how to stand up without making it obvious she was fleeing. Crockett began gathering her documents, placing them back into the folders with care. I didn't come here to humiliate you, Governor. I came here to have the substantive policy discussion you said you wanted. But substance requires evidence. Evidence requires preparation. And preparation requires actually caring enough about the people you govern to know what your policies are doing to their lives. She closed the last folder and looked up one final time. You're right that Americans want leaders who've been tested. But the test isn't how long you've held office or how many titles you've had. The test is whether the people you serve are better off because of your leadership. And based on your own administration's data, the people of Arkansas are not better off. Their schools are worse. Their teachers are poorer. 68,000 of them lost health care. Those are not my numbers, Governor. Those are yours. That's your test, and the results speak for themselves. The moderator, sensing the conversation had reached a natural conclusion, began to offer closing remarks, but Sanders interrupted, her voice raw. This is why people hate politics. This is why people don't trust Governor, Crockett said, and her voice was not loud, but it carried absolute authority. The people who don't trust politics are the teachers in your state working 2 jobs. They're the families who lost health care. They're the students sitting in underfunded classrooms with 12-year-old textbooks. Those are the people who don't trust politics, and they don't trust it because leaders like you promise results and deliver cuts. Sanders stood abruptly, nearly knocking over her chair. I don't have to sit here and be lectured by someone who— You're absolutely right, Crockett said calmly. You don't have to sit here. You can walk away. But the 237 people who wrote those letters can't walk away from your policies. The teachers can't walk away from $39,000 salaries. The students can't walk away from underfunded schools. Walking away is a privilege you have that they don't. Sanders stared at her for one more long moment, and something in her expression finally broke completely. Without another word, she turned and walked off the set, her heels clicking against the studio floor, the microphone still clipped to her lapel, trailing its wire behind her until a production assistant rushed forward to disconnect it. The camera held on Crockett. She had not moved. Her expression had not changed. She sat in perfect stillness, her folders stacked neatly in front of her, her posture composed, while across from her the empty chair Sarah Huckabee Sanders had occupied slowly rotated on its base from the force of her departure. The moderator, visibly shaken, attempted to continue the program, but Crockett raised one hand gently. If I may, she said, I'd like to say one more thing. The camera focused on her. This conversation wasn't about partisan politics, she began, her voice steady and clear. It wasn't about Republican versus Democrat. It was about accountability. It was about the basic principle that when you hold public office, you have a responsibility to the people you serve, and that responsibility is measured in results, not rhetoric. She looked directly into the camera, speaking not to Sanders anymore, not to the moderator, but to everyone watching. Governor Sanders walked into this conversation believing that her experience and her titles gave her authority. But authority in a democracy doesn't come from the office you hold. It comes from the trust you earn. And you earn that trust by serving with integrity, by telling the truth, and by making decisions that actually improve people's lives. She paused, and something that might have been exhaustion crossed her face just briefly before she continued. I'm tired of leaders who think experience means you've learned how to avoid accountability. Real experience means you've learned from your mistakes. It means you've listened to the people affected by your decisions. It means you've done the hard work of governance, not just the performance of it. Her voice softened. To every teacher in Arkansas making $39,000 a year, to every family that lost health care coverage, to every student in an underfunded classroom, I see you. Your voices matter, your lives matter, and no amount of political spin or deflection or walking off a set can make your reality disappear. She gathered her folders and stood, the movement unhurried and dignified. That's not partisan politics, that's just math, and the math doesn't lie. The broadcast cut to commercial, but the moment had already gone viral. Within hours, the 23-second silence would be the most shared political clip of the week. The image of Sarah Huckabee Sanders' empty chair, still rotating slightly from her departure, would become a symbol. And Catherine Morales, the fifth-grade teacher from Little Rock, would receive 47,000 emails of support from around the country. But in that moment, in the studio, there was only Jasmine Crockett standing alone at a table covered in documents. The evidence of hours of preparation spread before her like an indictment, and an empty chair across from her that said everything words could not. She had been dismissed at the start of the conversation for being inexperienced, for being performative, for not understanding the hard work of governance. But by the end, it was clear who had done the homework and who had simply shown up expecting their resume to do the talking. Governor Sanders had questioned her qualifications. Representative Crockett had answered with Arkansas's own data. And in the end, the silence, 23 seconds of absolute devastating silence, had said more than any prepared statement ever could.